The story does not begin with gunfire or flags raised over conquered land. It begins in silence, inside offices where ceiling fans turn slowly and the air smells of paper and ink. Clerks bend over ledgers. Telegraph wires hum softly. Numbers move across pages, neat and calm, deciding outcomes far beyond these walls. Outside, ships leave Indian ports under heavy skies, their hulls packed with tea, jute, cotton, grain, and steel. Cranes creak. Dockworkers shout. The cargo represents sweat, land, labor, and time. It represents value. Yet when these ships disappear over the horizon, the wealth they carry does not come back in the same form. It dissolves into something abstract, distant, and unreachable. This is where the Real story begins, not with conquest, but with accounting. On paper, India is being paid. For every shipment sent to Britain, for every factory that feeds the Imperial machine, credits are issued. These credits accumulate in accounts held in London, denominated in sterling. They're called balances. Sterling balances. The name sounds solid, respectable, modern. It sounds like savings. It sounds like security. Britain presents it that way, as proof that India is not being robbed but compensated. The empire insists this is how a civilized global economy works. Goods flow in one direction. Money flows the other. Except here, the money never actually moves. It sits in London, controlled by Britain, released only when Britain allows it. India works. India exports. India fights in imperial wars. And its earnings pile up as promises it cannot freely touch. This is the hidden architecture of power. There are no chains around wrists. No soldiers guarding vaults in Bombay or Calcutta. The restraint is quieter and far more effective. The money exists, but not where it is needed. It is credited, but not spendable. It is acknowledged, but not usable. Britain tells India the balances are safe. They are backed by the pound, one of the world's strongest currencies. They are protected from risk. They are part of a grand financial system. But safety without access is not protection. It is confinement. Think about that. What good is wealth you cannot use when you need it most? While the numbers grow on British books, conditions at home grow tighter. Prices rise. Supplies thin. Industrial plans stall. The contradiction sharpens with every passing year. India is producing more than ever, exporting more than ever, contributing massively to the empire's survival. Yet its own economy strains under scarcity. The official explanation is always temporary. Wartime disruption, shipping constraints, administrative delays. Britain assures Indian officials that everything will be settled later, after the war, after the crisis, after stability returns. The language is soothing. The tone is patient. But time itself becomes a weapon. Delay compounds damage. Needs do not wait. This is a contrarian truth that rarely appears in textbooks. India was not poor because it lacked productivity. It was not underdeveloped because it failed to generate value. It was poor because it was never allowed to fully claim what it earned. The wealth existed. It was measured. It was recorded. But it was held at a distance, governed by rules written elsewhere. This is what makes the system so powerful. It turns exploitation into administration. It transforms extraction into procedure. The empire does not have to seize anything openly. It simply decides when and how India may access its own money. The stakes of this arrangement reach far beyond balance sheets. During wartime, India finances Britain's military operations through forced exports and deferred payments. Soldiers are recruited. Supplies are shipped. Food is diverted. The cost is enormous. After the war, when rebuilding should begin, the same system blocks recovery. Factories need machines. Railways need steel. Cities need investment. But the funds required sit idle in London, locked behind approvals and negotiations. Even food security is affected. When shortages threaten millions, India still cannot freely spend its balances to import grain without permission. The abstraction becomes lethal. Picture the contrast. In London, sterling balances are discussed in calm voices inside wood-paneled rooms. Charts are studied. Risks are calculated. The priority is the pound itself. Britain has emerged from war exhausted, financially fragile, desperate to maintain confidence in its currency. Releasing too much sterling at once could weaken it. That is the fear. So restraint is imposed. From Britain's perspective, it is prudence. From India's perspective, it is paralysis. Two realities exist at the same time, and only one is allowed to matter. This is what makes sterling balances different from simple theft. Nothing is taken outright. Instead, control is asserted over timing, access, and permission. India holds claims, not cash. Credits, not currency. And claims are only as strong as the power behind them. Britain holds that power. It decides when conversion is allowed. It decides what imports qualify. It decides how much is released and when. The imbalance is complete. India owns the money in theory. Britain owns it in practice. Imagine running a household this way. You earn a salary, but your employer keeps it. They promise to release it later, when conditions are right. You can request small amounts for approved expenses. But major purchases require negotiation. Emergencies require patience. Now scale that arrangement to a subcontinent. Scale it to hundreds of millions of people. Scale it across decades. The damage becomes structural. Growth is delayed. Capacity is lost. Momentum fades. And all of it happens without a single visible act of violence. The brilliance of the system lies in its invisibility. To the outside world, India appears financially integrated into a powerful empire. It holds sterling, the currency of global trade. Its accounts show large balances, suggesting strength. Critics are disarmed by numbers that look impressive. How can India be exploited if it is accumulating wealth? That question shuts down deeper inquiry. The illusion works because it speaks the language of modern finance. Ledgers replace chains, credits replace coercion, and the moral cost disappears behind procedure. Inside India, the effects are harder to ignore. Administrators struggle to plan. Industrialists cannot import what they need. Prices behave unpredictably. Inflation creeps in as goods are scarce, but money, paradoxically, cannot be mobilized. The economy feels both rich and starved at the same time. This contradiction confuses observers and exhausts policymakers. Every solution seems to run into the same wall. The money is there, but it is not here. At the center of the story is a question that refuses to stay buried. How did a bookkeeping system become a weapon powerful enough to shackle an entire economy? No armies marched to enforce it. No declarations announced it. It grew quietly, normalized by habit and authority. Once established, it did not need justification. It simply needed to continue. And it did. Year after year, shipment after shipment, balance after balance. Britain's justification is always framed as responsibility. Managing a global currency requires discipline. Sudden releases could destabilize markets. The empire must think systemically. These arguments carry weight in financial circles. They sound rational. They sound adult. But they also reveal the hierarchy. The system exists to protect the center first. The periphery absorbs the cost. India's suffering is an acceptable risk in defense of sterling's prestige. For India, the lesson is harsh. Economic dependence does not require direct ownership. Control over currency, settlement, and timing is enough. If another power decides when your earnings become usable, your sovereignty is already compromised. This realization does not arrive all at once. It builds slowly, through frustration, denial, and quiet anger. Early on, many still believe the promises. They expect fairness to assert itself. They assume the empire will do the right thing when the crisis passes. But crises have a way of extending themselves when delay is profitable. The true cruelty of the sterling balance system lies in how it distorts responsibility. Britain can claim it owes India money, while simultaneously refusing to pay it in any meaningful sense. India, meanwhile, is blamed for underdevelopment, inflation, and shortages that stem directly from restricted access to its own wealth. The victim is recast as inefficient. The system erases its own fingerprints. As the years pass, the balances grow larger. On paper, India appears wealthier than ever. In reality, the pressure builds. Needs multiply. Expectations rise. The gap between what exists and what can be used widens. This gap is not just economic. It is psychological. It teaches restraint where ambition should be. It breeds caution where investment is needed. It trains an entire system to operate under artificial limits. Think about the scale of that impact. An economy is not just numbers. It is confidence, planning, risk-taking, and momentum. When access to resources is uncertain, every decision becomes conservative. Every plan shrinks. Over time, this shapes behavior. It shapes policy. It shapes the future. The sterling balances do not merely delay growth. They redirect it inward, stunting possibilities that will never fully return. By the time the mechanism becomes visible, it is already deeply entrenched. What began as wartime accounting has hardened into a permanent structure. The empire relies on it. The pound depends on it. And India is trapped within it. The story that follows is not just about finance. It is about power disguised as procedure. It is about how modern empires rule without spectacle. And it is about the quiet realization that wealth controlled by another is not wealth at all. This is where the real conflict takes shape. Not on battlefields, but in negotiations. Not through conquest, but through consent shaped by illusion. Sterling balances are the opening act, the unseen foundation upon which everything else rests. To understand what comes next, one must first accept this truth. The chains were never visible, but they were real, and they tightened with every shipment that sailed away. To understand how the system endured for so long, it is necessary to see it through the eyes of its time, when the British Empire appeared unshakable and sterling looked like the safest promise in the world. The pound was not just a currency. It was a symbol of order in a chaotic global economy. It settled trade, anchored contracts, and reassured investors. Britain presented it as the spine of modern finance, backed by experience, institutions, and reach. For India, being paid in sterling was framed as inclusion into this elite system. It was described not as dependence, but as partnership. The empire insisted that participation in sterling was proof of progress, not subjugation. From London's perspective, the arrangement looked elegant. Indian exports flowed steadily into British ports, feeding factories, households, and wartime logistics. In return, Britain issued sterling credits, carefully recorded and responsibly managed. Balance sheets told a reassuring story. India's accounts showed rising numbers, a sign, at least on paper, of growing wealth. In financial circles, these balances were discussed as evidence of loyalty and contribution. India was not being drained. The argument went. It was accumulating assets. The empire's defenders pointed to ledgers and asked critics to look again. The numbers seemed to speak for themselves. Inside India, the same story was repeated, often by officials trained within imperial systems. Sterling was portrayed as safer than gold, more flexible than hoarded currency, and more sophisticated than local alternatives. In an age of global instability, this mattered. Wars, depressions, and collapsing currencies had shaken confidence everywhere. Against that backdrop, Britain sold sterling as shelter. Keep your wealth with us, it implied, and it will be protected from chaos. For administrators facing uncertainty, the promise was tempting. Stability felt like strength. Delay felt like patience. Control felt like order. The empire reinforced this belief with ritual and authority. Financial decisions were wrapped in formal language and procedure. Requests were reviewed. Committees deliberated. Approvals were granted or deferred with careful explanations. Everything looked measured, almost benevolent. There was no sense of urgency in London's offices. Time worked differently there. Delays were framed as technical necessities, not political choices. And because the empire still stood tall, these explanations were rarely challenged openly. This is how illusion sustains power. As long as Britain appeared strong, its currency appeared trustworthy. As long as sterling appeared trustworthy, the system appeared fair. The empire's global reach reinforced the message. Maps colored in red, shipping lanes traced across oceans, banks operating on multiple continents. It all suggested permanence. Against this backdrop, questioning sterling balances felt almost irrational. Why doubt the very foundation of global trade? Yet the illusion depended on one crucial condition: control. Britain did not simply hold India's balances. It governed them. Every release of funds required approval. Every conversion into goods required justification. Sterling could be spent, but only within limits defined by British priorities. This control was rarely described as restriction. It was described as management. The language softened reality, but the effect was unmistakable. Indian factories needed machinery to expand production. Orders were placed. Requests were submitted. And then they waited. Shipping constraints were cited. Wartime priorities were invoked. Foreign exchange considerations were raised. The answer was rarely an outright refusal. It was a postponement, a partial approval, a reduction. Each delay seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of denial. The balances grew, but capacity did not. Food shortages exposed the system's fragility even more starkly. When supplies tightened and prices surged, the expectation was simple. India had earned wealth. It should be able to use it to import food. But here again, sterling stood in the way. Import approvals were slow. Quantities were limited. Britain's own needs took precedence. The logic was brutal. The empire had to feed itself first. India would have to wait. The currency system turned hunger into a financial issue, debated far from those who suffered its consequences. Despite these realities, the illusion persisted because it was reinforced by comparison. Other regions fared worse. Some colonies had no balances at all. Others were paid in depreciating currencies. Against that backdrop, sterling still looked like privilege. This comparison muted dissent. It reframed constraint as advantage. India was not oppressed, the argument implied. It was favored. That framing mattered. It shaped how officials spoke, how decisions were justified, and how long the system endured without serious challenge. Another factor strengthened the illusion: complexity. The mechanics of sterling balances were not simple. They involved exchange rates, clearing arrangements, and international settlements. This complexity created distance. Few outside financial circles fully understood how the system worked. Fewer still could explain its consequences clearly. Complexity protected power. It discouraged questions. It allowed those in control to claim expertise and dismiss criticism as misunderstanding. When confusion prevails, authority fills a gap. Within this environment, silence became policy. Many recognized the strain, but hesitated to speak. Challenging sterling meant challenging the empire's core. It meant questioning the very structure that governed global trade. That was not a small step. For administrators whose careers depended on cooperation, silence felt safer. For institutions built within imperial frameworks, compliance felt natural. Over time, this silence hardened into habit. The illusion was also sustained by time itself. Each year that passed without collapse seemed to validate the system. Sterling did not fall. The empire did not crumble. The delays continued, but catastrophe did not arrive immediately. This reinforced a belief that patience would be rewarded, that the system, though slow, was ultimately sound. But this logic confused endurance with fairness. Survival does not imply justice. It only implies that the costs are being absorbed somewhere else. And they were. Inside India, the economy absorbed them quietly. Investment decisions were postponed. Infrastructure projects were scaled down. Industrial ambitions were tempered. None of this produced dramatic headlines. It produced stagnation, a slow erosion of possibility. The illusion allowed observers to mistake the stagnation for inevitability. Underdevelopment was blamed on local factors, not structural restraint. The system concealed its own role in shaping outcomes. Even critics who sensed something was wrong struggled to articulate it clearly. How do you argue against money that exists on paper? How do you protest wealth that is technically yours, yet practically unreachable? The system weaponized ambiguity. It allowed Britain to acknowledge India's claims while denying their fulfillment. It allowed officials to agree in principle while disagreeing in practice. This duality kept conflict contained. The elegance of the system lay in its moderation. There was no single dramatic act to rally against, no clear moment of seizure, just a series of decisions that always seemed justifiable. The empire rarely said no. It said later. It said not yet. It said under review. Each phrase pushed resolution further into the future, and the future, in imperial economics, belonged to the center. As long as Britain's position remained strong, the illusion held. Sterling was defended at all costs. Its prestige mattered not only economically but politically. A strong pound symbolized a strong empire. Any threat to it was treated as a threat to order itself. In that hierarchy, India's needs ranked lower. This priority was rarely stated openly. It did not need to be. It was embedded in every decision. The longer the system persisted, the more normal it felt. New officials inherited it as a given. They learned its rules and adapted to its constraints. What began as an emergency arrangement hardened into routine. The extraordinary became ordinary. And once something becomes ordinary, it becomes invisible. That invisibility is what allowed sterling balances to survive scrutiny for so long. Yet beneath the surface, tension was building. The numbers on the balance sheets were growing too large to ignore. The gap between apparent wealth and lived reality was widening. The illusion required constant maintenance, constant explanation, constant delay. And every delay carried a cost. Confidence eroded quietly. Patience thinned. Questions began to surface, even if only in private. One question in particular lingered, unspoken but persistent. If this money truly belongs to India, why does India need permission to use it? The system had no honest answer. It offered only procedure, justification, and time. For years, that was enough. But systems built on illusion depend on belief. Once belief weakens, control must tighten. And tightening reveals the chains. By the end of this phase, sterling balances still looked impressive on paper. The empire still looked strong. But the conditions that sustained the illusion were beginning to crack. The world was changing. The costs were mounting. And what once seemed like stability was starting to feel like confinement. The stage was set for pressure to expose what patience had concealed. The cracks appeared when pressure could no longer be absorbed quietly. War had changed everything. Britain emerged exhausted, its finances stretched thin, its reserves drained by years of survival spending. At the same time, India's sterling balances had grown to levels that were impossible to ignore. On paper, they represented enormous value. In reality, they represented a promise Britain was not ready to honor. Paying India in full would mean releasing sterling into global markets, weakening the pound at a moment when Britain could least afford it. And so the logic hardened. India's money would remain locked, not because it was owed, but because it was needed elsewhere. This is where the core economic mechanism reveals itself with brutal clarity. India exported real goods, tangible things, food, raw materials, industrial inputs, and labor. Britain paid not with immediate settlement, but with deferred claims. These claims financed Britain's war effort and post-war survival. They allowed the empire to live beyond its means. India, meanwhile, absorbed the cost. Inflation rose at home as goods were scarce. Shortages became routine. Development plans stalled because capital could not move when it was needed. The wealth existed, but it functioned only as support for someone else's stability. When India attempted to convert these balances into action, the response was resistance wrapped in caution. Requests to import machinery were met with warnings about foreign exchange pressure. Appeals for essential goods triggered discussions about shipping capacity and global shortages. Every conversion risked one thing Britain feared above all else, a loss of confidence in sterling. The pound had to be protected. That priority overrode everything else. Even if India paid the price, even if growth was sacrificed, even if millions felt the consequences. This moment marked a turning point. The illusion of mutual benefit began to collapse under the weight of its contradictions. What had been presented as partnership now looked like hierarchy. India held credits, but no leverage. Britain held control, but no obligation to act quickly. Prices rose within India, not because money was scarce, but because goods were. Industrial plans froze as approvals lagged. Investors hesitated. Confidence weakened. The economy strained under the weight of its own trapped earnings. Picture the scenes the system produced. Factories stand ready to expand, but lack the imported parts to do so. Warehouses sit half empty, waiting for supplies that are approved on paper, but delayed in reality. Ports are crowded with paperwork rather than cargo. Administrators move between offices, carrying requests that return stamped, deferred, or reduced. Each delay has a cost, measured not only in money, but in lost time and opportunity. These are not dramatic collapses. They are slow suffocations. The most damaging effect is psychological. An economy forced to wait for permission begins to internalize restraint. Ambition narrows. Risk-taking fades. Plans are designed not around potential, but around approval. Over time, this reshapes behavior. The system trains caution where confidence is required. It rewards compliance over initiative. The longer it persists, the deeper it cuts. Growth is not just delayed. It is redirected inward, constrained by artificial ceilings. As the war ends, expectations rise. There is talk of reconstruction, of new beginnings, of a different future. India expects that its sacrifices will finally translate into freedom of action. The balances are there. The need is urgent. But Britain's position has not changed. If anything, it has hardened. The post-war world is unstable. Britain fears capital flight, balance of payments crises, and loss of global standing. Releasing India's funds too quickly is seen as a threat. And so restraint continues, even as justification grows thinner. This is when the system becomes visibly suffocating. What once felt like delay now feels like denial. What once sounded technical now sounds political. The argument that sterling must be protected begins to ring hollow when protection comes at such a clear cost. India is no longer just waiting. It is being held. And that distinction matters. Once recognized, it cannot be ignored. The realization spreads slowly but decisively. The problem is not administrative inefficiency. It is structural control. Britain does not merely manage the balances. It uses them. They are leverage, not liability. They give Britain time, flexibility, and breathing room. They give India frustration and constraint. The imbalance is no longer abstract. It is visible in every stalled project and every denied request. At this stage, the question changes. It is no longer about timing. It is no longer when will the money be released. It becomes something more fundamental. Why does Britain control it at all? Why does India's wealth sit at the mercy of another country's currency strategy? That question cuts through the language of partnership and exposes the core reality. Control over settlement is control over destiny. Once this truth is seen, the system loses its invisibility. Every delay feels intentional. Every restriction feels strategic. Trust erodes. Patience turns into resentment. The sterling balance system, once defended as modern and rational, now appears as a mechanism of dominance refined for a financial age. It achieves what force once did, but with far less resistance. The turning point is not a single decision or announcement. It is a shift in understanding, a recognition that the system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. It is preserving Britain's position by constraining India's options. That clarity transforms the conversation. Negotiations become more tense. Demands become firmer. The moral argument grows louder, even if it is still resisted. From this point on, the system cannot return to its earlier innocence. The cracks have widened into fractures. The sterling balances are no longer just numbers. They are symbols of deferred justice and constrained sovereignty. They embody the cost of an empire trying to survive by freezing the future of those who sustained it. The economy continues to strain. The costs continue to accumulate. And the gap between what India has earned and what it can use becomes impossible to justify. What once appeared as stability now looks like stagnation enforced by design. The hidden weapon has been exposed, and exposure changes everything. The unraveling of the sterling balance system did not come with a single dramatic rupture. It arrived slowly, through negotiation fatigue and the quiet admission that the old order could not hold. As independence approached, the balances that once symbolized partnership became symbols of unfinished business. They sat at the center of tense discussions, framed as obligations, yet treated as burdens by the very power that owed them. Britain did not deny the debt. It managed it. Releases were calculated, paced, and timed to protect Britain's own recovery first. The empire was retreating, but it was determined to retreat on its own terms. For India, the transition was deeply uneven. Political sovereignty arrived faster than economic freedom. The chains were loosened, but they were not cleanly removed. Years of restricted access had left scars that could not be erased by a signature. Industrial capacity lagged behind need. Foreign reserves were thin. Development plans began with constraints already built in. The economy India inherited was not empty, but it was shaped by absence, by opportunities delayed too long to fully reclaim. The release of sterling funds came in fragments, often tied to conditions, priorities, and schedules that still reflected British concerns. Britain needed time to stabilize the pound in a fragile post-war world. It needed to manage global confidence. And so India's claims were honored carefully, not urgently. What was returned could not compensate for what had been lost in momentum, planning, and trust. Time, once denied, could not be restored. The deeper legacy lay not just in numbers, but in mindset. Decades of enforced restraint reshaped economic thinking. Policy became cautious. Foreign exchange controls tightened. Suspicion of external finance hardened into doctrine. The memory of trapped wealth lingered, shaping decisions long after balances themselves faded from headlines. This was not paranoia. It was experience. India had learned at enormous cost that paper well held elsewhere could evaporate when it mattered most. The sterling balance episode also revealed a broader truth about power in the modern world. Control does not require ownership. It requires leverage over systems that others depend on. Currency, settlement, and access became tools as potent as armies once were. Britain's ability to delay payment achieved what force alone never could. It shaped behavior, constrained ambition, and redirected the future without ever appearing openly coercive. This is why the story does not end with independence. Its logic lives on. Today, global reserve currencies still determine who settles first and who waits. Payment systems still decide whose trade flows freely and whose can be interrupted. Sanctions, freezes, and restrictions echo the same question that haunted India decades earlier. Who earns? Who holds? Who decides when value becomes usable? These are not abstract concerns. They are the architecture of modern power. Imagine a nation producing relentlessly, exporting value to the world, yet finding it earnings inaccessible when crisis strikes. Imagine being told the money exists, but not now, not yet, not without approval. That experience is not confined to history. It is repeating itself in different forms, under different names. The tools are cleaner. The language is more technical. But the imbalance remains. The collapse of the sterling balance system did not restore what was taken. It ended the pretense that delay was neutral. It exposed how stability can be engineered to benefit the center while draining the edge. And it left behind a warning written not in slogans, but in consequences. Economic chains are rarely obvious. They do not announce themselves. They look like trust. They sound like order. And by the time they tighten, the damage is already embedded in the future. This is why remembering this story matters. Not as grievance, but as clarity. Because systems that hide power behind procedure thrive on forgetfulness. And understanding how India's economy was shackled without a single visible chain makes it harder to miss the same pattern when it appears again. If this story changed how you see money, power, and history, subscribe for more documentaries that uncover the hidden mechanics behind global events. And share this story so others can see how the quiet language of finance has shaped the world we live in today.